So a little bit about me. My name is Mark McClain. I am the co-founder and CTO of Akanda Inc. We do basically network management and orchestration tied with OpenStack. As far as my involvement with the OpenStack community, I'm a member of the OpenStack technical committee. I was also a former Neutron PTL for a year, also served on the OpenStack board of directors for a while as well. Additionally, also how it integrates with OpenStack, with OpenDaylight and NFV. I was involved with meetings even before, Etsy and some of the NFV stuff took off. I mean, I think Neela was on his first day of the job, so it's kind of, that kind of integration. So, why do we want to discuss this? What's really our motivation for discussing? Really, it's the exchange of ideas. When we start taking a look at ecosystems, we do have developers, we do have community members who overlap between the two, but we also have a number of folks who just pretty much remain siloed in one or the other. And sometimes, it's by employer choice, or sometimes it's just trying to survive because both projects are moving at a breakneck speed, and trying to track both of them is a really gargantuan task. Also to improve the interactions amongst the ecosystems. I think commonly what you get is if you talk to developers who are not familiar with how the other ecosystem functions or have only a vague idea, sometimes the results that get produced can kind of be, there can be a little bit of misunderstanding or just a little bit of confusion why a particular ecosystem produced a result when you're like, hey, this is the result we should get, not the one we actually got. And if you understand how they work, you kind of look at it and you go, okay, yeah, that's pretty much what I expected to happen. So kind of share that. And also, no one group holds a lock on good ideas. This isn't limited to these two groups. A lot of these foundations and principles have come from other groups that existed long before either OpenStack or OpenDaylight. And governance ultimately impacts the technical output of the project. How you govern it, how you manage it, really dictates what's going on. So, let's kind of level set. Let's cover a little bit of the basics. About OpenStack, I think most people have seen these before. The project's 5 years old, celebrating its 5th birthday in July. The foundation itself, and the OpenStack Foundation, actually was created almost 2.5 years later in September of 2012. And it is a separate foundation, which is a little interesting when we start talking and doing a little comparison. OpenStack has 39 projects within it. There are some projects which are part of the core definition, which we'll talk about as well. And there's 27,000 members on the roll of the OpenStack Foundation, and 3,700 project contributors. So it's a really big, massive project, lots of moving parts. I'm kind of required, I think, when I talk about OpenStack to show you this image. It doesn't really have any relevance because I promised you no technical content other than to say you have compute, networking, and storage. Additionally, this seems to be the other. If you ever watch an OpenStack presentation, this image also comes up. Now, for OpenDaylight, it's a little bit newer. It's April 2013. It's a Linux Foundation collaborative project, which is really interesting because if you start taking a look at what the Linux Foundation is doing, they basically have cornered the market on foundations as a service. I mean, within the Linux collaboration, there's 25, 26 different collaborative projects. And the cool thing about that is, you're going to get the benefits and the experience of the Linux Foundation staff. They're the ones who know how to put together events like this rapidly. They know how to bootstrap ecosystems. They know how to deal with the legal issues around open source, the social issues of building ecosystems. I mean, it's really a great way to launch it, and it's nice to have that professional staff. Within OpenDaylight, I think I was counting 48 projects listed on the project page in the latest Lithium release. And as Neela said, I think it was 502 contributors this morning. And so just as I showed you a required image from OpenStack, I think this is somewhat the required image of OpenDaylight. We have our structure. Okay, we now talk technical, but looking at all these boxes, either OpenStack or OpenDaylight, how do they actually get there? So we're going to dive in a little bit into the actual governance structure. Be honest with you, if you want a comparison of the two bylaws between OpenStack and OpenDaylight, if we take a look at just the purpose paragraph, that is the definitive difference between the two. The OpenDaylight bylaws are going to be a little bit more comprehensive, a little bit more additional wordy, lengthy. OpenStack has a more concise writing style, but when you actually dive into it, they have a number of different companions. When you compare them, it's really interesting because you can see, where things have been learned, the changes that have been made between them. But it's very interesting that when you take a look at the actual organizational purposes that state in their bylaws, just how much boilerplate there exists. really there's only about a kernel of like a sentence or two that really matter. I'm not going to bore you with the entire like dissection of the bylaws because it's hard enough to make it reading material at bedtime and stay awake. It's after lunch, and so it's going to be even trickier. So, let's kind of, pull out some of the choice, juicier bits of it. And so licensing, obviously OpenDaylight's EPL, it's Eclipse public license, pretty common with Java. OpenStack's Apache 2 licensed, but it also has a requirement for the individual and corporate CLA. So, right there we're starting to get a little bit of difference in how the ecosystems function. The Eclipse public license explicitly deals with some patent in intellectual property, and whereas Apache leaves a few gray areas, that's followed up with the corporate CLA to try to address those issues, to try to address common ownership issues. Problem is when we start taking a look at the ecosystems, EPL is a very easy to use license. You log in, you commit. But when it comes to OpenStack, this is where we get a little bit of difference and we get a little bit more friction. And this is something where, OpenStack ecosystem, the corporate contributor license requires that each company that's a member of the OpenStack Foundation maintain a list of developers who are, eligible to submit, authorized to submit to make sure that you have a clean intellectual property history. It gets a little interesting because, you now have, some of these organizations are very large and it's not like it's not a self-maintaining list at the current moment, as well as the individual. It's very daunting if you're new contributing to an open source project, and the first thing you do is log into Garrett, and then presented with a long CLA that tells you that you're signing away certain rights. And so, from the OpenStack Foundation, putting on the technical committee hat, this is something the technical committee at OpenStack has been pushing back on the board of directors to kind of clean up. So, this is kind of one of those things where we get a little bit smoother experience within OpenDaylight. The actual structure of the board of directors is kind of interesting too. You take a look at OpenDaylight, you've got, you have a number of different membership levels, but you have you have platinum end users, some percentage of gold members based on platinum members, and then silver gets one, and then you have 2 individual contributors. And so the board size is kind of dynamic. OpenStack's a little bit different. It's a very balanced board. You have 8 platinum members, 8 gold members as long as there's 8 platinum. And then 8 individual members. So you actually have 3 distinct groups. So depending on how you look at it, you can say, the groups that are paying the most money get the most influence in OpenDaylight. OpenStack gets balanced a little bit more because of the individuals. Or you could also say that typically what you're going to find is that in reality they're essentially the same, because a lot of times the platinum members are also the same ones contributing to the most developers, who are also likely to also generate enough individual following that they can win the individual director. It's interesting when you take a look at, they both have affiliation limits. So OpenStack, I think it's 2, OpenDaylight I think is 1 in terms of the numbers. And so so basically you can't stack the board one way or another. The technical governance is a little interesting. We have the technical steering committee and we have the technical committee. They essentially serve the same same purposes, but their makeups are a little bit different. When you start taking a look at OpenDaylight, you've got membership. The membership includes the platinum designees, and you've got the project leads, and then you have some at-large members. OpenStack, it's all 13 at-large members. Where that's interesting is, like Dave Myers, who pointed out, it's easy to kind of gamify the TSC a little bit, because you can, if you don't like a platinum's designee, you could just elect somebody else's PTL. And so they had, technically for projects, so one of the changes they made last summer at OpenDaylight is to say, oh wait, the board can actually authorize you to go over your one designee per, to kind of fix the gamification problem. But you do have another problem is, the structure that you see for the TSC in terms of OpenDaylight is very similar to what OpenStack started with, because the precursor to OpenStack Technical Committee was something called the Project Policy Board. Rackspace nominated 4 people. You had some at-large elections, and then PTLs kept adding on. But what you end up doing is that over time you start adding, this board gets bigger, bigger, and bigger, and bigger. And when you get really large, you run into the problems of how do you function, how do you get things done, and so that is why, when faced with that choice, originally having project leads got a seat at the technical table, to changing it to there's just 13 at large, members who have to run across the project. So, that's kind of a little bit different. I think sometimes people say OpenStackers like to vote on everything. So, this kind of falls into that category. And both of them do have affiliation limits. With OpenStack, you can't be more than 50% of the board. And basically, when I say affiliation, you either work for the same company or you work for a company that controls your company. Like EMC and VMware, they have enough common parentage and ownership between the two that they're essentially the same entity in the eyes of most organizations. So that's where you get some of that. So, we've kind of taken a look at membership of the committees, but like how do the projects run at a macro level, kind of diving into it. The life cycles of the projects are a little bit different. I start with what OpenDaylight looked at, and you have the TSCs actually managing what kind of core is, because they vote at every step of this is a core. You go from proposed to incubation to mature to a core project. You can even go to like a higher level, top level. It's a very well-defined life cycle. And when we started out with OpenStack, we had a similar life cycle. One of the challenges you get is kind of like, you go from proposal to incubation, and then what's the expectation of how do you get out of incubation? Some projects can move really quickly. Some projects can move really slowly. And so trying to figure out, how do we make this work? Some projects could feel like failures if they didn't get out of incubation fast enough, which is actually a problem in terms of building community, building momentum behind projects, because you would get some who would expect that they should graduate faster. We had this in OpenStack for a while. We had a very similar pipeline, but then more recently, we changed to what's basically been calling, the OpenStack Big Tent. Basically, if your project is, open design, open development, open community, open source, yes, we love you, you're in, you get voted in as long as you're related to the OpenStack mission, which I think is to take over the world with the cloud. It's a very broad mission. But there's kind of a little caveat. So like everybody can get in. There's not really that incubation maturity period anymore. With the OpenStack Big Tent, you're really taking a look at, letting the community and letting the market decide how these projects mature. Do they gain acceptance? And so, that's really kind of an interesting, because now instead of having this board that goes and evaluates you and gives you a gold star, it's now the users, it's now the developers who are kind of dictating and saying, okay, yes, we've made it. We as the larger community versus having just an elected body decide to hand out exclusive, awards. But one of the differences, whereas the TSC decides what's core, with an OpenStack, there's kind of the board and the technical committee are two separate bodies. And so they have distinct responsibilities. So in terms from the OpenStack side, the technical committee can accept a project as being part of the OpenStack community. You get OpenStack contributor status. But at the end of the day, all we can do is recommend, hey, this particular project should be eligible for trademark status. It doesn't make it eligible for trademark status. It doesn't make it part of the OpenStack core. The technical committee recommends it, and then there's a separate board committee and process that works with the entire community for saying these features are part of the OpenStack core, the trademark, and so it works out that way where the board's going back and saying, okay, now that the technical committee has recommended these projects as eligible, the community and the board come from the other side and actually decide what components those are. So you get some interesting dynamics there, because sometimes the board, we may recommend a project and members of the board and the community may say, no, this project's not ready yet, or no, these particular features aren't enabled in all deployments, and so you kind of have to go through that game. And so the core process deliberately moves kind of slow. It's getting faster, and also is very methodical in which capabilities to support. It's a self-scoring, self-reporting system. But getting to that next level of OpenStack core project is kind of an add-on. Now, talking about the Big Tent, it's kind of interesting. There's been a development in the last cycle or two about how we open up, specifically looking in the OpenStack networking project in Neutron. And then, I think Kyle's kind of coined it the Neutron Stadium, for lack of a better word, in terms of, it's for plugins, for drivers. You can add APIs, because, not to get too technical, because I promised technical, but OpenStack is just a facade API under the underlying implementation. So, you need APIs and extensions to add those. So it provides that common form, common consistency, and that shared governance allows the vendors a way to plug in. So that, kind of getting off that detour for a little bit. What is the criteria for spawning a project? It's pretty, both communities are kind of in agreement. Yep, mission alignment, it doesn't really make sense to go spawn a project that's not related to what we're working on. Taking a look at the leadership, approved by the TSC, the TC, take your pick, it's got to be approved. Who are the initial committers? And, one of the things I think we learned from ecosystems is that choose your initial committers carefully. There's always there's a little bit of a challenge. You want to launch a project off the ground. You want to get as many people involved. But what sometimes happens when you take a look at these projects is committer status will be given to all the people who show up the first day. And sometimes those aren't necessarily the people you want to have a healthy ecosystem. They're sometimes very interested parties, but they're sometimes, so it's you have to be very careful about how you choose your initial committers, because fundamentally all these organizations are social organizations. Yes, they're meritocracies, but you can end up with committers who actually don't contribute to your project in a healthy way, but removing them is actually very difficult from the social side. So, generally it's like if you're starting a project, I always recommend take a smaller set. You can always make it larger later, but if you start with a really big set, it's harder to make it smaller until you either have to wait till a person just effectively leaves on their own, or you get enough other committers that they kind of just get drowned out. So, and then, the criteria is, can we duplicate? What is permissible for duplication? In OpenStack, our project guidelines say you can't have gratuitous duplication. We don't want 3 APIs that do the same thing. If you look in the project spawning guidelines for OpenDaylight, it's a little bit different. It doesn't actually expressly say that, but ultimately people are looking at that because you don't want everybody to go spawn a project just because they don't like the people involved in another project. But sometimes you do need to allow duplication. It allows for innovation. It allows for opportunities for problems to be solved fresh and anew. But duplication does create confusion on the end user side. It increases the burden in terms of testing and documentation if you have multiple production ready items that have overlap. So, from the technical side, weighing that is is a very important thing. And so, OpenStack has the notion of core reviewers, and then, OpenDaylight has committers. For both projects, there's some similarities. Contributors have really accumulated a track record of contributing to the project. They believe in the project. They know the code. They know how to contribute to it. It's based on meritocracy. Your code shows up. You review. You work with the community. You deliver something that moves the project forward. Each project teams kind of nominates and selects its own individuals. It's great. Now, with OpenStack, that's where the project stops. That's where that process stops. TSC, it's a little interesting that the TSC actually has oversight of committer selection. You have to propose and nominate. And so, coming from the other side, it's really interesting because you have another body which is really forcing on kind of that reviewer cohesiveness by taking a look at who's getting in and who's getting the keys to commit code. Which way is better? I don't know if we know yet. Do you let the project self-govern and kind of figure it out, or is it nice to kind of have a little thicker oversight? From the OpenStack side, it's kind of one of those questions you always discuss while you're eating dinner or something. It's like, what if you had a project that has kind of run off the rails? What do you do with that? How do you nurse it back on? How do you fix that? And so, the core teams and the reviewer teams are very critical to keeping projects moving. And one of the other critical components to keeping projects moving is, what are the meetings? How are meetings structured? If you go look at OpenDaylight, it's interesting because the meetings are attached to a location and time. So you say that this meeting happens at 2 p.m. on, Pacific time. There's also WebEx for screen share and voice. IRC for kind of, you see lots of infos in the logs. But OpenStack, the meetings are a little bit different, which is all meetings are in UTC. So immediately, it probably jumps out to everybody, we're already stuck in this time zone craziness. If you do, meetings are attached to a specific location, or even UTC, You're always going to be burned in the spring and the fall as governments mess with the clock and different hemispheres switch from summer to fall because they all don't do it at the same time. So it's kind of fun. With UTC, if you have UTC meetings, it's very common to have people show up an hour late or an hour early when the time changes, especially because there's like a 3-week gap in the spring. In the fall, it's only a week. Same kind of thing if you do it fixed on a specific time zone because you're counting on somebody to actually understand and know all the different ins and outs of when the times change. One of the interesting things is that some of the OpenStack projects will rotate their meeting times for global participation. So they'll hold a meeting that's very friendly for Europe and North America. And then the opposite week, they'll hold a meeting that's probably, friendly for APAC and North America is typically what you find. And so you end up with this flip-flop schedule of, basically saying, okay, we're going to try to inconvenience everybody a little bit to try to increase global participation. Which is why, in OpenStack, it's a little bit different, which is IRC is a requirement for meetings. One of the things that's been found is really pushing that for many non-native speakers, they feel most comfortable typing. Even then, IRC conversations can still move a little fast for non-native speakers. But when conversations are held on, via phone call or via like WebEx and whatnot, sometimes you can run into a little bit of challenge that when you talk with and as a project leader, I would run into some non-native speakers who were too afraid to raise their hand or speak up because they were afraid they would say the wrong things. They were afraid that their idea wouldn't come across properly, but they were more than happy to write you a 10-page email that would explain everything after they validate it. And so it's kind of a little bit different philosophy there, about how do you be globally inclusive, how do you move it, for better or for worse, English is mostly what's moving these projects around, and so anybody who's not, like if I were to have to participate in a project and use a different language other than English, I would be terrified. So anybody that jumps into the fray, my opinion is always like we should give them all the tools and kind of give them every opportunity to participate and not be afraid and encourage it. So that's kind of one of the different things. Moving the meetings around is a little bit different. I think, from a ecosystem and growth perspective, and especially growing in other regions, I think it's nice because some of the meeting times, if you travel frequently or if you ever end up in other parts of the world and have to participate in meetings that are very convenient for the West Coast of the US, sometimes you're taking meetings at midnight, 1 a.m. It's some really awful times, and it's impressive that you see that some of these people do this week after week after week who participate. And it's like you do it once and you're like, never again. I hate taking a meeting, at 1 in the morning. So kind of some things to consider there. As far as communication goes, I think, everybody has mailing lists. OpenDaylight has multiple project mailing lists. OpenStack has just one big list. It's the OpenStack dev list. And so, with OpenDaylight, kind of consider it to like being drinking through lots of little hoses. You can plug them up. You can plug your filters. It's very easy. Unfortunately, OpenStack is just going to blast you with email, and then so what everybody ends up doing is you end up filtering it. And the hard part about that is that it's a self-filtering in terms of subjects. And so how do you match those up? And it's very common sometimes for stuff to get lost in the shuffle where somebody will have mistagged an email and misspelled. And so your filters kind of drop it into just, the kitchen sink bucket, and you've got 10,000 messages that aren't really filtered, but you're keeping them around just in case you miss something. Like a lot of my mailing list filters are set up to capture common misspellings, look for other random keywords to just try to get stuff out that may have dropped through. But it's kind of interesting in terms of dynamics is you've got one community. The OpenStack dev mailing list is basically like having 4,000 people all talking in the room. It's like if you go to, before you go to a concert or the theater or whatnot, and everybody's like talking and you hear all this noise, it's like, how do you get the conversations you want to hear out? Sometimes it's kind of nicer to have them in segmented rooms. But on the flip side, it's also harder to learn unless you're monitoring all the different lists, what's going on in the other rooms. So, it's kind of interesting. It's how you balance that out. because sometimes a particular thread will kind of flame up, and it's kind of nice to know that, hey, maybe somebody else is discussing something that, particular project, you've thought about it, but you really don't want to, you've kind of, it was backburnered, or maybe somebody's covering something new. So, which one's the right one? I don't know, but they're kind of different philosophies about how they handle them. Release cycles, we both kind of emphasize the simultaneous release cycle. OpenStack does have some exceptions to it. Both have stability releases, so I'm kind of ignoring those because those are part of just having a simultaneous release. But you have client libraries. Some of the OpenStack projects are actually openly experimenting with different cadences. Some will release, instead of doing milestone development releases, will just release when a feature is ready every 6 weeks, but promise that they're going to release when the simultaneous release comes. They're going to make one release that they'll maintain a little bit longer. So you have these releases, how do you name them? It's, again, this is kind of just a little lighthearted thing, but, it's like ODL, it's like we're rocking the periodic table here. Names are predictable. We could just go right to left, keep going through. Hey, we got 118 of them, right? Who knows? Trademarks may get a few out, but still, it's going to be a long time before we have to think about what goes next. OpenStack, it's a little murkier. It's an alphabetical series, kind of like Ubuntu. They're geography-based, and I put the asterisks there because there's some exceptions to it. It's usually based on the summit location. So, you can pick out some locations. Some of them make sense. Some of them, it's kind of like, hey, that's a cool name. It's voted on, which means that there's no predictability. You can guess and be like, one time we thought Jekyll would win because, and actually gone through the process of getting it, and then it ended up being Juneau, a little middle nowhere town. Or you get weird things like, the current Liberty release. If you wanted to know why OpenStack is named Liberty, that's Liberty, Saskatchewan. Liberty is actually not in British Columbia, which is kind of funny. So, if most Americans would complain if we were to hold a summit in California and then name it after something in Kansas, which is about the equivalent distance. So, there's also cultural challenges that we found with the current release with the name for M, which is Mitaka. So originally, community crowdsourced all the ideas, voted, created a wiki. There was a vote. They went through and pruned the names that wouldn't be trademark eligible. And so it was named after a place and named after a ruler of Japan who then colonized Korea. So you get So when you have names, they're very tricky, especially because places are typically named after people. People have complicated histories. And when you start getting into a global market and global, how do you deal with those things? And so, that was one of the rare times where it's like the OpenStack Foundation's like, yep, here's our new name. And then 2 days later, it's like, no, we're pulling this one back. And so now we have Mitaka, because worked with everybody. But it was one of those things that even if you try your best to come up with the best names to try to filter out the ones that might be offensive, you can still have these issues. So, talking about security releases, I think as mentioned earlier today, we're super happy. I think Colin mentioned they turn around security release in like 4 days, which is it's hard to do that. Having worked on security team, on Neutron side, getting all those tests, getting discovered, and making sure you replicate it properly is hard. Requires a dedicated team. Because you got to manage triaging. Responsible disclosure is kind of hard, because you want to tell everybody that you got this problem, but you can't tell everybody until you know what the fix is, and you have to follow protocols. Within OpenStack, the team was created in 2001. If you go back and look, they publish all their OpenStack advisories, and some of them are completely ridiculous. Like somebody decided to test that if your password field was over 4,000 characters, it would just break and Keystone would always authorize you because the buffer overflow. I mean, it's like weird things like that, but that's the kind of the run-of-the-mill kind of crazy things you get with security. But publishing those. OpenDaylight's a little bit interesting because, the team and the response actually came as, there was the vulnerability kind of sat around kind of dormant for about 4 months and kind of timeline-wise. And so really, after everybody said, hey, we need to fix this, the community came together, really developed processes. Now there's actually like strong processes around it. But it's kind of that hard thing of like, how do you do it? How do you do it as you grow? Because vulnerability management is not the most exciting thing. Sorry, not to belittle security engineers, but for like a lot of developers just like building new, nice things. But one of the nicer things in terms of having corporate backing, having wider, bigger communities is you're finding security engineers, the folks who really like hardening the systems, really just love security and digging into it and writing tooling and going through the complicated steps of saying, but wait, this isn't secure, this is why, and coming up with those. So, that's kind of interesting from that side. But, those things take lots of effort. So, in terms of community building, governance code of conduct is kind of interesting. Some people love them, some people hate them, some people just say, oh, everybody should act like an adult. But the hard thing about that is, when you have a community and you have an open community, you've got to, basically the community has to police and enforce itself. What I found interesting is, this isn't something that you find like encoded in bylaws or anything, but you go to like OpenDaylight, either wiki or website, it's like, basically says, we don't have a code of conduct. It's like lists of 3 things of like, be nice, be open, be respectful. Kind of in a weird way, it's by saying we don't have a code of conduct. There's one kind of effectively written without passing. I think just setting the minimum standards, it's kind of nice to have one of these things. Is it going to make people behave? No. But when they do, when it's community, you have to take corrective action. It's kind of nice to have that tool available, to have those expectations at least documented, even if they are pretty much common sense. So, OpenDaylight's kind of, it's kind of exists. OpenStack has a little bit more formal version of it of, be considerate, be respectful. These are just the bullet points. If you go to the link, I mean, it's very long, thought out, but, that's one of those things I kind of think that, they do add, it does help, it does kind of set the expectations. It also, as a community, when you need to come back and tell a contributor that they're not meeting those expectations, you have them written out in advance versus making them up in arrears and saying, oh, I know this when I see this. So, kind of looking down the road, where does this governance get us? What are some of the challenges of governance? I think one of the things about governance, and you have a wide variety of projects, is Conway's law is going to come into play. The systems are really going to represent the communication structures. That was talked a little bit about this morning about the collaboration between the different projects and the abstraction layers and how those are mapped. One of my favorite things is if you've ever been to France, that their railway company split in 2. So they ordered $15 billion of trains, but because the other company didn't measure all the platforms, just some of them, the trains didn't fit. So, it's a direct consequence of Conway's law. So really making sure they fit. And from the governance side and technical committee side or steering committee side, that's actually hard. You get a common form of the leadership, but you really have to look for and find ways to foster communication amongst the rest of the contributors, whether you're committers, your code writers, testers, how do you get that integration, that cross-pollination? Events like this are very nice because it's a very high bandwidth way of doing it, but how do you do it the other months of the year when, people are on, working out of their office, their home, wherever they're based, no matter where in the globe. Another one of the challenges from governance is contributor diversity. And there's actually problems if it's high or if it's low. So kind of taking a look at the low, you've got very few people, sometimes one, if the project starts dwindling. If a contributor leaves, it can be catastrophic. Or if a company removes their support for, maybe you've got, 10 contributors, but if 8 of them all work for the same employer and that employer now decides this is no longer a priority, your project can kind of be left can kind of really just be left rotting. So, from the technical side, it's like, how do you foster diversity? What kind of metrics do you look at? Within the OpenStack Technical Committee, we actually measure diversity and kind of at least label projects at risk from being dominated from a single vendor. Yes, they work in an open source, but if, the real people doing the work, if they were to leave, that burden now falls back onto the technical, community to deal with. And so it's fostering that, making sure, they can handle. Also, if you have a low diversity, scaling can be kind of difficult because you're at the whims of whatever, select group is contributing. So they may not want to work out as much. Or if you have a very low number of people, you can just have burnout. You can just have project leads who are just kind of pull and burn out. Open source is kind of interesting when you take a look at their critical pieces within our infrastructure, which don't have a whole lot of diversity, don't have a whole lot of contributors, but are very critical. I'm sure people have seen other references to like NTP. NTP basically has one person maintains it and does all the testing. Fortunately, Linux Foundation, some other have stepped up and kind of helped with that, but that's a real at risk. High diversity is also kind of challenging too. Consensus is much harder to achieve. You have lots of cooks in the kitchen. They have conflicting needs. People, if you ask people which way they want to go, everybody's going to point a random different direction. That actually makes scaling hard because now you have more people throwing things into the mix, more code reviews. How do you move those through? How do you reconcile all those? It's very easy to get duplicative work. Taking a look at what those governance structures, the bylaws and policies, if you take a look at both organizations, I think how they foster and how they work to, improve, low diversity or in the event it's high, how we work to make those work faster, I think are still challenges that both organizations, have to work on. And then, just complexity. Standing up OpenDaylight, standing up OpenStack, it's hard. It's kind of like flying an airplane. The one on the left, it's an old school 747-100. Took 3 people to fly it. You get closer, the one on the right, it's one of the Dreamliners. You have computers. The complexity is still there, but it's being hidden. It's easier to operate the machine. As an organization, when open governance model, how do we get to that complexity? How do we solve it? The CEO of Red Hat wrote, he recently wrote a book about open organizations, and it was interesting when he was talking about, how do we solve the complexity? Could an airliner be, could there one day be like an open source aviation? I mean, traditionally airliners have been very monolithically top-down design. When we're doing, in terms of open source and open ecosystems, it's kind of interesting how those are paired together. Is there a better model? I don't know. It's kind of hard. It's still kind of early when you take a look at it. I mean, 5 years is really a long time in terms of technology, but in terms of governance and structures, you take a look. A lot of governments have taken a long time to end up where they, to get to where they need to be. Fortunate thing is that as long as the communities are talking and sharing, you have an opportunity. You have a real opportunity to learn from each other. Experimenting with different choices is good. That's why I don't want to say that like one ecosystem is superior to the other, because quite frankly, I think they both are both doing a very good job. Could both work in different areas? Yep. Could they share better in different areas? I definitely think so. And those results are going to really help everyone to improve. So, and both are going to change over time. The one thing that's constant is change. All the organizations look very differently than what they did, if for those who were at the last OpenDaylight Summit. And now it's a huge change from even OpenStack summits. They've changed over the years, so it's kind of nice to see. So, thank you very much for your time. I think I have a few minutes for questions. Anybody has any? Yes.
Mark, tell me about the committer list. Do they ever age out? Is there a certain governance for if we haven't committed for a certain amount of time before the right of the?
So the question is do committers ever age out, like if you haven't committed in a certain time? I couldn't find anything specifically written down in terms of OpenDaylight, do committers age out? Aging out committers in OpenStack is a little bit more of tribal convention, for lack of a better word. So the different projects all kind of do it differently. Some are very draconian and will say, okay, if you're below this cut threshold, and at this date, we just say, okay, yes, we thank you for your service, but we also recognize that life moves on. You've moved on to other things. No harm, no shame. It's just you're not actively participating in the project, and if you're not following it, we don't think you can be an effective reviewer. And so it's kind of, but what that number is and how they do it is completely different. Some, it's a non-event. Everybody's like, the person will get cut and be like, hey, thanks for all my time. I'm sorry, maybe I'll be back. And some people do come back. And others, it can be very contentious because of, it's real interesting from the contributor side and the committer side is that you're building up followership, you're building up people that follow in thought leadership. And so when some of those parties feel like they're losing their leader, they may fight a little bit more to keep them. So, Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.